Thank you very much again, Theo, for allowing us to be part of this nice festival. It's a pleasure. It was really nice being in Cape Town in May and presenting bits and pieces of what I do and how I approach the use of technology. I'm not a composer. I'm pretty much a techie guy, but I do work with sound, and I do love transforming sound into different things and different objects, sound objects. Uh, I have a background in music, but I also do sound engineer, and I also do bits and pieces in for film and television. And I'm a member, an active member of AES, Audio Engineering Society, and the Portuguese branch of the section of the AES, the Audio Engineering Society in Portugal is not very big. It's kind of small, uh, but the fact that it's small, we actually know everybody from the AES section of Portugal, and that's where I kind of met Nuno a few years ago. He was doing um, I actually met him. He was working on vocal synthesis for this company. He'll talk about that, I think. And I said, I want to do what he does. It was very inspiring in those days. It was really cool. But years moved on, and Nuno went for his PhD, where he actually created this really cool thing that I had the pleasure to present to some of your students back in May, which is sound particles. It's a really nice tool. And it's a tool that you get addicted to it because it's like Rui was saying just before, I think it's technology starts moving you instead of, and you're more of a curator because you listen to the software as you put in sounds to it and see what it does, and you're actually more curating and filtering out what you don't want or what you want. So it's really interesting that approach. But I'll shut up for now and move the floor to Nuno. He will talk about not just sound particles, other bits and pieces that they've been doing, and I'll throw in questions as he presents. Is that okay, Nuno?
Sure. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to share with others a little bit of the things that we have been doing. So I always have a passion for music and for technology. I actually end up having a academic career as a university professor. I was teaching both computer science in one university and also music technology on a different one. So I always have the feet in each one of those fields, and just have this passion for doing crazy things like Marco mentioned. One of the first projects that I did was a software that uses sampling with samples of choirs and allows you to write the text that you actually want the choir to sing. And this was actually implemented in East-West products and is used by composers around the world. And then I had this crazy idea because besides music and technology, I also like movies. And at some point, I realized that the most interesting visual effects that I was seeing on the screen, most of them use particle systems. That is a technique used by computer graphics where you generate thousands of small points that together create things like fire and smoke and fairy dust and desert storms. And it was probably 16 years ago or so. And then I realized, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you could do the same thing, but with sound? Imagine creating thousands of very small sounds spread around you, and all together will create this amazing soundscapes. But at the time, it was only one crazy idea, like so many that passes through our mind. And then in 2012, I had finished my PhD on a different topic, on the singing voice resynthesis. And then I started to create, okay, let's start creating something as a computer nerd that I am, because this space doesn't fool anyone. So I started to creating my own software called Sound Particle. So let me give you an overview of the software, just for people to better understand I'm talking about. I assume you can see my screen.
Yes,
okay.
we can.
It's excellent.
So the idea of sound particles is to create the CGI approach, but for sound. So when we talk about image, you usually have 2D and 3D image, 3D image software. So into the 2D image software, you work with pixels. It doesn't matter if it's static image like Photoshop or if it's a video editing, but pretty much you are laying pixels on top of pixels, okay? And then sometimes you have another types of 3D software like Maya or Blender when we get this endless infinite space, you position objects, you have virtual cameras, and then pretty much you use image but on a different kind of approach. Well, when it comes to audio, usually we only have the traditional audio editor that pretty much is the audio equivalent of a video editing software. So the idea here is to do something different. So the idea is, okay, we have this 3D space, okay, so I have here this 3D space where things happening. I have each one of those points that I have in here represents a different sound source moving around. Then one of the things that we do is we use this concept of a virtual microphone, so almost like the virtual camera. So you say, okay, I have the sounds happening here on this space, and then I have the microphone here, and the microphone could be stereo, 5.1, 600 ambisonics, or whatever I want. And then depending where is the microphone, where are the sounds, all the render is taken into consideration, the distance attenuation, the Doppler, if the sound is moving, those kind of sound gets rendered, and you do all of those things. But one of the things that we have here, because besides having this idea of a native 3D kind of software for sound, is the idea of using particle systems, which means that you can easily come here and generate thousands of sounds. And let me give you a small example. So imagine that I'm going to start with a completely empty project. So imagine for now that I have here, I want to create a battle, and the battle has thousands of sounds around. The typical approach would be I'm going to a digital audio workstation and start importing. Explosion here, another explosion, machine gun, another machine gun, and I will continue adding things until I end up probably after 8 hours of work with 50 tracks with 50 sounds playing at the same time. With some particles, I can come here, for instance, say, okay, I want a particle group, so I have here now 100 particles, which means 100 objects or 100 sound sources, okay? But I could say, no, I don't want 100, I want 1,000, or I want 10,000, which means that now I'm going to have this virtual space with 10,000 sounds happening in there. Then I would say, okay, let's bring some audio material. So imagine that I want to come here and bring into the software some audio things. So let me see, for instance, let me see, okay, let me open here some demo material. Okay, for instance, no, probably, let me just find this. Okay, some demo material, where I have the demos here. Okay, so I have here this kind of material. Okay, imagine that I simply want to import all of these audio files. So now what happens is that I have here around 50 audio files, but I have 10,000 particles, which means that each particle will simply come here and randomly select one of those audio files and going to reproduce them. Then I'm going to say, okay, where do I want the particles? Well, if I want to create a stadium, this could be a good starting point for a stadium. But in this case, okay, I want a battle, so let's create like 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. So now I have 10,000 sounds spread over 1 kilometer because I want to simulate this huge battle. Also, I'm going to add here a microphone, and it's stereo. It could be 600 ambisonics. It could be 5.1. I can even create custom configurations of the microphone. And when you think about 10,000 sounds, probably you think, okay, 10,000 sounds is going to be a big mess. It's going to be almost like a noise-like kind of sound. But actually what happens is that if I come close here to the microphone, I can see that I only have a few sounds very close to me. Okay, I have thousands of sounds very far away, just adding to the rumble. And then I have a few sounds coming close to me. And for me, this is the recipe for a good soundscape, because any soundscape, it doesn't matter if it's Central Park or Times Square, or if it is the middle of the woods, or some other scene in a restaurant. Pretty much what you have is thousands of sounds, most of them very far away, and then a few close to you. So you get both a scale, but a detailed sound at the same time. So now we have these sounds. Okay, great. Now what I can do now? Well, let's add some movement. Of course, I can, for instance, come here and say, oh, let's add some random velocity, which means that now each one of those particles are randomly moving like soldiers moving around on the battlefield. Also, one of the things that we can do is, okay, I have 10,000 sound sources in here, but I only have 50 audio files, which means that each audio file is going to reproduce a lot and a lot and a lot and a lot. So one of the things that we can do is add these audio modifiers that pretty much is like a random pitch shifter or random effect that I apply to each particle. So I can have random things like random gains, and some particles are louder, some are softer, instead of all particles playing exactly the same levels. I can have random delays and say, no, I don't want all particles to start at the same time. I want some to start now, some to start later on. I could have like random equalizers. I can even have random subbands, which means that each particle are going to reproduce only a subband of the spectrum, almost like having different harmonics moving in different ways. I can have a random pitch shifter, okay, and say, okay, I want here each one of those particles to have a pitch shifter and slightly changing the pitch. Or I can even use granular, which means that by default, each particle will select the audio file and play from start to finish, okay? But with granular, you say, no, each particle simply goes to the audio file and simply go there, grab a grain. It could be half a second, it could be 10 seconds. But in this way, even if I have only one audio file as a source material, I'm creating multiple layers with multiple things using granular on top of this. And since we are using a lot of randomness in here, we felt the need that this randomness should have some constraints. Okay, so imagine, okay, I have a random pitch shifter, and I said, okay, it's more or less between -1 octave to +1 octave. But even that, we can even be more precise and say, okay, do I want each number to be more or less uniform between -1 octave to +1 octave, or if I want most of the values to be around 0 with only a few going to the more extreme values. Or imagine I'm working with music and say, no, I want -1 octave, 0, or +1 octave. I don't want in between values, because I want this to continue, have the exact tuning without detuning things too much. So these are some of the abilities that you can do with all of this randomness. Also, since we are talking about this all randomness, the other interesting thing is that this is random numbers, which means that I have something here, but if I want, I can roll the dice and say, okay, give me a different take, or a different take, or a different take. So in all of these cases, it's always 10,000 particles, but each particle, it's going to be different. So I can create my battlefield and then press this random button here, and now I get the second take on the same scene and create multiple takes of the same soundscape. In terms of microphones, of course, like I mentioned, we are able to get these custom microphones. Imagine that you say, okay, I want Dolby Atmos or 22.2, or imagine that you say, no, I'm doing an installation, so I have this layout that is custom, where I actually have a sound, a speaker over there, another speaker over here. So I can start creating a custom layout and make sure that the render is actually done for that particular layout. For instance, some time ago, there was a play in New York, and they decided to create a virtual microphone with 20 channels, but with exact positions of the 20 speakers on the movie, on the theater, and which means that you are actually rendered for that venue. And the good thing is that since we have this concept of a virtual microphone, it actually separates the sounds and the output format, which means that I have this scene today, it's 5.1, great, but if tomorrow I want a Dolby Atmos version of this, is only changing the microphone and re-render, or imagine that I say, no, I want first order ambisonics or third order ambisonics render. So I'm actually simply changing the microphone and get the exact same scene for the things that we are doing. Of course, we can have still the traditional mono microphones like Omni, figure of 8. You can have stereo pairs like XY, Bloomline, middle side, all of those things. So this is sound particles, a quick overview. Of course, there is other things that you can do with this. We can import video. You can even import a CGI scene. So imagine, for instance, that I'm doing something here. So imagine that someone give me a scene that was created with Maya, some animation. I can actually come here and import this FBX file that was exported from Maya. And here I'm able to know exactly all the pieces, all the 3D objects that I have in here. So imagine that I say, okay, I want a sound on the left engine and another on the right engine. So I can do all of those things, or I can simply import everything. And by importing things, all the automation here. So as you can see, we have these objects here. I have here my microphone that pretty much follows the virtual camera. And by doing this, I know, okay, something happening, the camera is moving, I have these objects there. Let me now import the video reference just to make sure that we are actually working on the right thing, okay? And what happens is that now I'm going to change this for my 360 view, okay? Now, as you can see, all the objects are being tracked, okay? And even if they are off screen, they are still being tracked on the exact position, so which means that when they enter the scene, the sound continues perfect, coherent with the image and everything else. So this is a very quick overview of sound particles. This is our main software. The software is currently being used in all major Hollywood studios. It was used in things like Star Wars, Dune, Game of Thrones, Stranger Things, more recently on Oppenheimer, Indiana Jones, and Mission Impossible. And it's used a lot, especially when people want epic sound design and create this highly complex sound design contents like big battles, big soundscapes, these kind of situations. And besides that, one of the things that we have been working is we have this passion for 3D sound, and we want to bring 3D sound to multiple professionals. And one of the things that we have released actually this year was this 3D synthesizer. So it's a regular synthesizer, a VST, works with MIDI. Okay, you can come here and start playing with this and get the sound out of it. Okay, but what we decided to do is let's create a synthesizer where the spatial, each part of the synthesizer and fully integrated with the synthesizer. So instead of having a stereo synthesizer that then you use some panners to move things around, no, let's put something where the 3D render, it's within the synthesizer, which means that, for instance, when I play here a note, actually all of this, this is our panner or 3D view. So all these points that you see moving around is actually objects. So each note can generate up to 8 oscillators, and each oscillator is going to have its own object. So I can actually come here and generate these things around, or something like this, or something like this. Okay, so, and having sound moving around on this interesting way. or something like this. So internally, what we do is, like I mentioned, we have these 8 oscillators. Each oscillator may have a static position, and you say, okay, I want this oscillator to go in the front, this oscillator to go to the left, this go to the right. I can create some randomness and say, okay, each oscillator, this oscillator goes somewhere over here, each note is slightly different. This goes over here, each note is slightly different. But then we can do more interesting things. We can use LFOs to control the position of sound, which means that the sound starts to jump around or move around depending on our LFOs. Or we can use an envelope generator and say, okay, I want the sound to start in the back, attacks to the center, sustains on the left channel, and then releases above my head. And by doing this, I have envelope generators now controlling the position of space. Or eventually, if I want to create arpeggios, I can come here and say, okay, let's add here my 3D position, okay, which means that now I'm starting to have these arpeggios, okay, that can create, but also not only the arpeggios and creating the notes, okay, but actually putting the panning with it, which means that now I'm going to start having 3D arpeggios around. So this is another tool that we have. Another one that we have also created is something called Space Controller. Pretty much allows you to use your phone to pan things around. So pretty much what you do is you simply use your phone and then you simply point, and then it's almost like a laser pointer where you want the sound that is going to where to have. And for us, we felt that using the mouse or knobs or even joysticks or something like that, it's much more limited, and this is much more intuitive. You can do much more complex things. You can simply point to want the sound there or there on the center or whatever above your head, and you do. It's much more. You get much more freedom, and then allow those freedom to create even more interesting things. This is some of the things, the tools that we have. We have others like Density that creates multiple layers of voices, also with 3D sound. We have a 3D panner that is controlled by the intensity of sound, which means that you can have panning in 3D, but reacting to the sound, which feels much more organic, and among other things. So this is a very quick overview. I could be hours talking about this product, but that is to simply give you this insight about the kind of things that we do. Just one other thing, Sound Particles is free for students, schools, and teachers, okay? We also have a book called All You Need to Know About 3D Audio that people can use to get to know more about spatial channel-based audio objects and the sonics and binaural. And yeah, pretty much is this. So Mark, now back to you.
Thanks very much, Nuno. It's really great to see your products. Can I throw you just 2 questions? First is, it's really a step forward in terms, well, not forward, but you diversed a lot from Sound Particles, because Sound Particles is, I would say, mainly software for building, like you said, soundscapes and big dramatic sounds for films. That was the main goal, I guess. But now your company is moving more towards music and how to embrace spatial audio for musicians and for young composers and bands and whatever. How difficult is it to have them work with your tools? I know this is a tricky question because it's very hard. Especially, it's not easy for young musicians to have lots of speakers and lots of fancy setups in home movie theaters and whatever. They usually just have a guitar at home and a pair of headphones. So I pretty much know the answer, but if you could ensure more on
Sure.
that.
So first of all, of course, I have a biased opinion. Okay, so take it with a grain of salt. But essentially, we have a huge passion for spatial audio, which means that we want to convince every single person in the planet to move and adapt spatial audio. And what we try to do is sometimes we have these tools like sound particles, and sound particles, okay, it's completely different paradigm, which means that you need to learn a bit and have some learning curve to be able to use it. But our goal is, okay, let's do other things that could be the entry point into spatial audio, and that's why we created all of these plugins that are people using them from music to video games, movies, sound design, those kind of things. Also, one of the things that we decided to do is pretty much all of our products support binaural, which means that you can use your headphones. Of course, will not be the same thing as using a speaker layout, but when you are trying things, for instance, one of the users that we have of Skydust is Jean-Michel Jarre. Okay, and even some weeks ago, he sent me an email, okay, I'm in the middle of the hotel, okay, this Skydust supports binaural, and said yes. So the idea is, okay, even if you only have a pair of of headphones, you use the headphones, and even with that, you can take advantage of all of those things. More in things like, for instance, in sound particles, you can even have multiple data sets for you to pick up what is the best for you. But for us, the idea is, okay, let's allow people to start playing with spatial, because sometimes there is this myth that 3D audio, it's about using a panner. And for me, it's if you think about 3D audio only as using a panner, for me, it's a limitation that you are imposing to yourself. Imagine that we say, okay, stereo, it's only about using a panner. So imagine that there is no stereo synthesizers, no stereo effects, no stereo reverb, nothing, just a panner for stereo. Okay, it's going to be much more difficult to create interesting things with stereo. So our goal is, okay, let's bring things. Of course, as a startup, we cannot go with every single idea that we have. So sometimes you need to keep some focus. But okay, let's start. We started with some particles. Now let's start having some plugins for audio effects. And now let's start having a 3D synthesizer. And let's continue creating things. And on the future, some particles will also become more digital audio stations. Yes, it's more for sound design, although there is people, for instance, a few months ago, I was at NEM, and the composer of Avatar 2 comes to me and say, yeah, I use sound particles for the Avatar soundtrack. But it's a much more kind of precise or kind of a niche kind of application. But the idea is, let's create interesting tools for spatial audio for people to play with it. Doesn't matter if you have a small computer with some headphones, or if you have a Dolby Atmos studio or a dub stage. We have all the products that goes from one end to the other end.
Mm-hmm. The other question, you kind of opened the window on that while you were answering my previous question, is what's the future for sound particles? Because sometimes spatial audio can be quite intense in terms of how to set up and how to implement those tools and use the technology freely, you know. And you kind of said, well, I know you're doing researching on that, but you kind of opened the window on sound particles becoming a digital audio workstation. How will that help future musicians and composers to compose spatial audio music?
So the idea is to pretty much take these concepts of sound particles and put that almost like a digital audio workstation. So imagine a digital audio workstation, but instead of simply dropping each track into a bus, okay, and you layer sounds on top of sound, so you have this bus and you put things over there. Imagine that instead of that, you need to put each track and put it on space, and then have a virtual microphone there capturing the sound like in sound particles. And for me, this has several advantages. First of all, is this independence in terms of format, which means that you go there, you create something interesting music. Yes, you render today as a 5.1, but tomorrow it could be fourth order ambisonics or Dolby Atmos, and you simply need to change settings on the mic instead of a typical digital audio station that pretty much when you do a new project, he asks, okay, what is the format that you want to use? And pretty much you are locked. If you say that is 5.1, you start creating things. If later on you want to convert that to 7.1.2, it's much more difficult. And then you have other concepts like this concept of particles. Okay, what would be the sound of 100 flying violins? Okay, I have a melody, I want this melody to use this synthesizer, but now instead of simply using the synthesizer and dropping this into stereo, now I want 100 flying violins playing that melody around in 3D. Okay, and that creates a new world of possibilities also. So a lot of interesting things that we could do with this concept of a 3D digital audio station that is slightly different. Once again, it's like image software. Sometimes you want Photoshop, sometimes you want a video editor, and sometimes you want something like Maya or Blender. And if you are a creative person trying to create things with images, yes, for some, a video editing software could be the best tool to achieve that, and others will create with 3D and CGI kind of techniques. The idea is to bring the same thing with music and audio in general and say, no, you have multiple possibilities of creating content. One of them, it's to think about things in 3D. And by doing this, it's a completely different mindset, and spatial starts right on the beginning. Instead of being something that you do everything and then in the end, okay, let's spend this because we want also a Dolby Atmos version of the music. No, you start thinking right from the start where you want the things, like for instance on the synthesizer, where you are actually composing automatically with 3D in mind, because by doing this, you are able to do things that would not simply be possible in any other way. So with Skydust, for instance, if I'm playing 3 notes or a chord, actually I'm generating 24 objects moving around that. If I use a regular synthesizer, I'll put it stereo and then, okay, maximum I can pan to channels around instead of 28 or 24. And even it's interesting because sometimes when we think about spatial music, you think about, oh, it's about having the guitars playing in the back or moving around. No, when you start having much more particles, interesting thing because you don't get the sound that is moving around, but you feel that you are on the 3D space that has life and is breathing and creating these very interesting immersive sounds that you actually, it's not very directive. You don't know how the sound is here and is jumping over there, but actually you feel that are in the middle of something that is flowing and moving around.
You become aware of sound in a different way, that's for sure. I think I'll stop the dialogue with you and try to move on to the floor in South Africa and see if there's questions. Theo, does that seem okay?
It's fantastic, and I would very much like to pose the first question. Wonderful software, Nuno, and I've played around with it. Your book forms part of our curriculum already, and it's a great tool. So thank you very much for that. I've been looking around for quite a number of years, actually, for a resource of that nature. So that's absolutely fantastic. Maybe I missed it in the software, but do you implement some form of Doppler pitch shift ability or? Yeah.
Yeah, so first it's good to know that the book is being used also over there. Yeah, the sound particles takes Doppler into consideration. Of course, you can disable if you want, but by default, the Doppler is enabled, which means that if I'm actually having a sound moving through, okay, I'm actually getting that kind of characteristic kind of sound. And it's interesting because even, for instance, let's take the example of Doppler. Imagine that I'm a sound designer and I want to generate a Doppler sound. Okay. Instead, if I'm using a digital audio station, I'm pretty much thinking about DSP kind of parameters. I'm going to say, okay, let's automate the volume, and now let's automate pitch shifting, and now let's automate equalizers, and we like that. when you start thinking on a 3D approach, it's a completely different approach. What you're thinking is, okay, I have a sound that is moving. Okay, it's moving. How fast? It's 50 miles an hour. It's 90 miles an hour. And then you put the microphone and you get this very abrupt Doppler, and you say, no, let's put the microphone further away. And you almost think like you do on an actual recording. You are thinking, okay, where I'm putting the microphone, how I want the car to move through, where I want to point the microphone. So you start thinking not at the low level DSP audio parameters, but you are thinking a higher level and get much more interesting things. So yeah, but Doppler is there at sound particles, and you take advantage of those things flying around and moving around.
If I could just add one thing, because I tend to think that composers do like a lot of Doppler effects, but you actually have a tool, right, Nuno, that just for Doppler. It's one of the effects that you have. It's not sound particles, it's not sky dust, but it's just a Doppler effect, which is quite interesting, quite nice.
Yeah, essentially with sound particles, because at sound particles we are actually tracking the object per sample, which means that if I'm using 48 kilohertz, I'm actually tracking the sound 48,000 times a second and take that into consideration. And then a lot of people, special sound designers from Hollywood, were asking, okay, I really like your Doppler. Have you ever considered have a plugin only for Doppler? So yes, one of the plugins that we have created is something only for Doppler that allows to put on the track and simply do the same algorithm that we have on sound particles, but now as a plugin.
Stunning, stunning. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, but I don't see any chat questions. Maybe you should just point it out to us if any questions on the chat do pop up. May I pose one more question to Nuno?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. This sounds computationally very, very intensive stuff. So you must have spent quite a bit of time optimizing the back end. Is all of this programmed in C, C++, or how does one do this?
Yeah. There is only possible language to programming something like this, and it is C++, because what we are doing, you need to worry a lot about performance, sometimes more even than performance. It's a matter of making sure that each callback of audio, you don't miss that deadline. And that's one of the worst things about programming about audio, is that you're doing a callback and the computer is asking you, giving samples for you to process, and then you have this very short time, like sometimes 1 millisecond or 2 milliseconds, that you cannot simply miss. So yeah, we need to optimize things. For instance, we have renders with sound particles up to 1 million sounds playing at the same time. So it's almost the equivalent of having a digital audio workstation with 1 million tracks at the same time. So yeah, we need to squeeze things a lot, especially because our users really like to go crazy and start sometimes we have users, I'm using 50,000 particles and this takes some time to render. Is this a problem? And said, no, it's 10,000 or 50,000 tracks on the digital audio station. So yeah, we need to squeeze the performance. We are constantly trying to squeeze the performance. Nonetheless, what we have always done with sound particles, because the initial idea of sound particles, on the beginning, you had to wait for the entire render to finish before you to start listen. And then, of course, with time, we start improving all of this. But what we usually don't do at sound particles is to start sacrificing quality because of performance. So we prefer to think, okay, imagine that we have limited CPUs that you can do whatever we want. And then we create our algorithms with the best sound quality, the best prestige quality, all of those things. And then algorithm is implemented, then we go there and squeeze and optimize things to make sure that it works also well in real time, especially if you don't go crazy. But that's the goal, is need to continuously improving performance, because it scales quite fast if you go crazy and say, oh, let's have 50,000 particles moving around.
Sure. Thank you.